Joining us, this is the France 24 debate. We're enjoying the big debrief after nearly 18 million French people watched the one and only candidates debate between incumbent Nicolas Sarkozy and socialist challenger François Hollande ahead of Sunday's second round of the presidential election. With us to talk about it, Aude Baron of Le Poste, the Nouvel Observateur.
Le Plus was before.
Excuse me. Le Plus is the Nouvel Observateur's interactive social media website. Also with us, Angela Diffley of sister station Radio France International, Freddie Winkler of ad agency J. Walter Thompson, and joining us from New York City from the look across the Atlantic is Nicholas Duncan of the Atlantic Council, and also with the French think tank IRIS. Welcome back to all of you. Just a couple of comments. You were talking about Twitter, Aude, earlier. A couple of comments that we received on Twitter. One from Aaron. Hollande surprised all. I think he did not kowtow to Sarkozy and showed fighting mettle and strength against the encyclopedia. Chris Bauer, producer at our channel, said, another thing you'll never hear in a U.S. presidential election debate, a candidate citing OECD statistics on education. A nod to what you were saying earlier about there being perhaps a little bit of a surfeit of statistics at one point.
Yes, I thought it got more interesting later in the evening, unfortunately.
But is that probably good or bad that they mention OECD statistics?
I don't think... I think statistics are statistics. Yeah. You know, people switch off largely, unfortunately, and you can combat one set of statistics with another. And, you know, they have to be done. You have to use them. But people switch off. People, you know, their attention strays. And it was much more interesting later on when... more inflammatory issues were on the table. I thought Sarkozy scored some points on the burqa issue when he exposed François Hollande voting for the resolution to ban the burqa, not voting and making sure he wasn't in the National Assembly on the day of the law over the burqa, and then finally saying, if I'm elected president, I will apply the law on the burqa. That is blatant incoherence, and it was exposed as so. He won a point there, I think.
Freddie Winkler, let me ask you about something that I noticed both candidates did a lot, but especially Nicolas Sarkozy. It's the use of the first person singular. I've done this, I do that. Not always the case with politicians.
Well, this, I mean, at the end is very much about a person. I think they've understood that it was very much about them. So François Hollande had to behave as and be seen as president, hence the me president I would. And Sarkozy had to try and tame that down, which he found very difficult. But what's interesting was he was the only one actually in closing to talk about, it's not about us. And he said, you're saying je, I. In fact, it's about the people, what the people will. And then he made a call directly onto the electorate of the Front National and to the centrists. But that was, I thought, for me, the key point in Sarkozy was that end, which I think much, much, much better than anything that he had done. Because he said, it's not about me. I'm not interesting. You don't care what happens to me afterwards. It's about what we do for you, the people.
All right, and now part of the right, you were mentioning earlier, all the tweeting and the commentary that was going on during the debate. It's what happens after the debate. And in every country, it's the same thing. You bring out the spin doctors.
We saw François Hollande who was quite vague, who blanked a number of times. At one point, he even yawned. He was very imprecise with numbers, and as he tried to make up for that, he seemed rather arrogant and a bit agitated, and spent his time interrupting.
I thought that Nicolas Sarkozy was on the defensive and, as always, preferred to make half-truths and confuse the subject, rather than talk about his campaign and proposals, of which we've still not heard anything.
What did you think of the post-debate spin? We noticed that on the two networks, they immediately switched to their regularly scheduled programming. It was a bit sudden for a lot of people.
Yeah, it was quite surprising because when you were looking at the trending topics on Twitter, of course, yesterday evening the debate was largely in front of everything. But this morning the debate itself wasn't first. But on Twitter, on the other side, people, you know, were maybe talking about something else. But when you were looking on the media, and especially, for example, on Le Plus, which is a participative media where you can post, you know, your comments and say what you think about each subject, today for 90% of the subjects were about the debate, and it was quite difficult for us because, to be very honest, we seeked some people defending Sarkozy because everyone was saying, François Hollande won. Well, you have to say also that in France, on the public debate, it's much easier to say that you're on the left wing than on the right wing, because usually when you're on the right wing, only a few people, dare to say it, so you're a little bit alone against the rest of the world.
Freddie, there was 300,000 tweets, and the French. I noticed in the French press they were saying this morning, 300,000 tweets. That's amazing. And Americans at the office here at France 24 were saying 300,000 tweets when you had 18 million viewers. That's nothing.
Yeah, bear in mind that Twitter is very small in France still. So you're still talking to people that are slightly older than you would be on Facebook. So it's not really yet something that's coming in use more and more because the media is taking it. You start to see the hashtags coming in subjects. But it's quite new and very few people still on there. It was quite funny though about last night. You're talking about the episodes afterwards. There was a lot of, oh my God, what are we left with now? We just finished this wrestling match. And what do? Suddenly we cut to, on one channel it was the lottery with 10 million euros to win, which is a little ironic. And on the other one was even more ironic, it was CSI, who murdered. So there was just, a lot of fun going on afterwards. But it was a very odd way of programming this, where suddenly you ended up and where people wanted to talk about it, see what was going on, truth's completely dead.
Absolutely. Huge anticlimax, nowhere to let off steam except on Twitter.
And France 24.
I'd like to come in and I'd like to debate it a bit on a couple of these points, if I might. First of all, I don't think it's right to, as Angela said, I don't think it's correct to say that citing facts and figures and statistics was actually boring to people. Much more in the French educational system, knowing your facts, knowing your figures, being able to recite the things that you've learned back is actually considered to be a sign of hard work and a sign of intelligence. So I think that the debate on that was actually a debate about competence and about, this is the only way that Sarkozy could say, you're not experienced enough, you don't know enough to fill this office. Because otherwise, if he'd said it directly, then in fact, Hollande would have come back and said, well, what about Obama or somebody like that? I also think that with respect to Twitter, you have to keep in mind that there was a lot of tweeting going on, not in French and not from France. I mean, and I don't know if anybody's calculated the worldwide audience for this, but I think that, this French election has attracted a huge amount of attention outside France, much more, I think, than 5 years ago, for the simple reason that the problems of the Eurozone are so great, and French leadership is so important in that, not only because France is half of the Franco-German couple, but also because the constitutional arrangements in France are such that when France decides something, it can implement it. And Germany is much more of a parliamentary system, and we've seen the hoops that Merkel has had to go through in order to get decisions. So I actually think that this issue of competence, this issue of who's tough enough, but also who's smart enough and who's experienced enough, those were all issues that were underlying a great many of these things. DSK, of course, had to come up. It was a danger on both sides, and it wasn't very well handled on either side. But I wouldn't underestimate the importance and the attention that's being given to this election outside the country.
Aude Baron, did you get a sense with your readers that the whole world was watching?
Well, with our readers, I would say no, because most of our readers are French, basically. But maybe one of the reasons why the world was interested in this election, especially, maybe it's because 5 years ago we had Nicolas Sarkozy against Ségolène Royal, and both of them were quite new. Any of them had been presidents. Where here, Nicolas Sarkozy is already president, so people have already heard. They know him, and and many media, especially the American and the British media, they have been pretty tough towards him. We have seen some titles, Sarkozy associated to the extreme right, and so you really feel that people were expecting Nicolas Sarkozy and less François Hollande. So were people interested? I mean, in the world, interested in the global election, or were they looking at Nicolas Sarkozy?
Well, I think they're looking at Nicolas Sarkozy, if I could just jump in quickly on this, because he's actually shown quite a lot of leadership. And the concern has been expressed, which I think last night's debate started to lay to rest, that Hollande couldn't exercise that leadership. And I think that people are really concerned that French leadership is required moving ahead. And I guess last night's debate was as much of a draw on that as it was on everything else.
And I think Sarkozy should not have got locked into a battle over statistics. He should have said to François Hollande, name one difficult decision you have made in your 30 years in your 30-year political career. And he should have also said which of the reforms I have introduced, which you have criticised heavily, which of them are you going to repeal, which of them are you going to maintain? Because he is extremely evasive, he's very good at criticising reforms, but is happy to benefit when the hard work is done,
but untested,
some would say.
As we said in part one, so it's all about appearing like you're a safe pair of hands. What does the debate ultimately change? Well, sometimes the one-liners linger longer than the actual outcome. Let's give you an example. 1988, the Civic Auditorium in Omaha, Nebraska.
I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
That was a great one-liner. However, Nicholas Duncan, Lloyd Benson and his ticket didn't win the election.
One-liners don't win elections, but there were some pretty interesting one-liners. Well, maybe Ronald Reagan's one-liner won the election. There you go again. But you could also argue that he was going to win the election anyway. Look, these debates are important for all the reasons that we've just discussed. And what Angela said about some of the points that Sarkozy could have made, I was very surprised that he didn't come out much more strongly in favor of the French cultural model, as you said, the Schengen area. They probably spent too much time on facts and figures in that sense, in the sense that that those things crowded out other points. On the other hand, it was a hell of a fight. And actually, that alone was worth seeing. And as one of the other guests said, I forget who, I think it was Ode, it was very entertaining. So, it's a good part of the democratic process, and it's also quite courageous for as monarchical a country as France, or as a country with as monarchical a presidency as France, to really get down into the mud wrestling like that, because then they have to go back up, onto the podium afterwards.
All right, speaking of mud wrestling, over in the UK, they know a thing or two about candidates' debates. The format, you might say, is a lot more common.
The Prime Minister has shown today he is incapable of doing his duty. Too close to a powerful few, out of touch with everyone else.
Weak and wrong. Can you remember anyone taking responsibility for Damien McBride? Can you remember that? What a lot of self-serving double standards we had from the party opposite. Let me just make...
Angela Diffley, that's just run-of-the-mill stuff. That's just last Monday. They were discussing the Levinson inquiry.
Absolutely.
This is just normal every day in the House of Commons.
It is. Quite a few people in the House of Commons have been debating with each other since they were at school together in the School Debating Society. So they're very, very comfortable. It's something that they do in British public schools, where many of our parliamentarians go to school. So that's a feature. Another thing is the House of Commons is a very small chamber. Everybody is very close, and that does create a particular atmosphere. It's very emotionally charged, and that makes for good debate.
And of course, it's a parliamentary system, not a presidential one, or as Nicholas Duncan was saying, an almost monarchical one.
Well, monarchical, I'm not sure. That's a bit pushing it, although maybe it looks like this. I think you'd get a lot of that in the States as well. But, in Parliament, if you had this in France, with the opposition or whoever is insulted would just leave. It happens. Sometimes you have that, and they all walk off. So you have this image of people walking off because there's probably too much pride in the French way of talking, where you can have fun with words, but never really attack as strongly as you see in the UK. You had good one-liners, though, yesterday, and I thought there was, a very interesting one from Sarkozy that started to go on the attack on the economy, when he said, you want less rich, but I want less poor.
Yes,
which I thought a very, very interesting way of going into it. And if you look at, in fact, all the results afterwards, what seems to come out is Sarkozy seems to be much better at protecting people in the economy, the debt, the international. He was more competent there. But where Hollande made a big difference was people feeling about their own pocket. So for the country, the feeling is Sarkozy would be better, but for people, the personality, what I have in my pocket, Hollande seems to have struck a better chord there. So quite an interesting difference between the two.
Sorry to interrupt, but that is precisely the reasoning behind my having written a paper, which, by the way, can be found on the Atlantic Council website, which says that they might elect Sarkozy as the president protector to do the international policy, where he's very capable and has been seen to exercise leadership, and then elect a Socialist National Assembly in June, so that you end up with a socialist government at home, a much more comfortable government at home, but a tough protector defending you abroad. And actually the French are sophisticated enough about their own constitutional system to know how to split their vote, which wasn't possible when the presidency was 7 years and the National Assembly was 5 years. But now that those elections are consistently back to back, this is actually a way to get both of the things that you just cited, Fred, that the French might want.
All right, and before we go, let's see if there could be surprises come Sunday. Every poll up to now has shown François Hollande in the lead. The gap continues to narrow, however. There was a poll there by BVA, one of the polling institutes, that has Hollande on 53.5. Some even have it on 52.48. Freddie Winkler was mentioning at the outset the National Front's voters, 6.4 million of them, very volatile. Could there be surprises?
Well, you can always have surprises. So, even if today some of us say Sarkozy could win or Hollande could win, it's always unexpected. Unfortunately, otherwise, the election wouldn't be necessary. But today the stake is double. You have on the one side the extreme right, which is quite difficult to understand because those people that we call les invisibles, so the people that we can't see, and basically those people,
blue collar, most of them.
Excuse me?
Blue collar, most of them.
Blue collars, most of them, and they live, in small cities. They don't make too much noise. So actually, no one hear about them, and no one is interesting. So, but what was interesting is when you look on the internet and when you look especially on the comments, and those people, they don't remain silent. It's just that we can't publish their comments. And just for a few examples, on our website, on Le Plus, many people were commenting the articles and saying, I'm defending Marine Le Pen, which is a leader of the extreme right. But the problem is that some of their sentences were either racist or, just illicit. So we couldn't publish them. So they tried to enter.
So their message doesn't get out as a result of that.
That's right.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. And of course, there's still 3 days to go. I want to thank you, Aude Baron. I want to thank Freddie Winkler, Angela Diffley, Nicholas Dungan for joining us from New York City. We want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Coming up next, it's time for business, and that'll be with Matthew Warren.